For me as a vegan, it's easy to be self-righteous. It's easy for me to say, shut it all down, smash all the cages, set all the animals free. That's easy, you know? But the whole reason why my YouTube channel exists is that I'm not really interested in easy answers to complicated questions. I'm interested in dealing with all the murky, complicated, you know, moral gray areas.
À-bas-le-ciel.
You too, boy, if you fuck with me, the police are gonna have to come get me up your ass. That's how I'm going out. With the punk motherfuckers that be showing out, they can start to mumble. They wanna rumble, a mix of men, cook your man apart like gumbo. Going off on a motherfucker like that, with a gat that's pointed at your ass. Give it up soon, ain't no telling when I'm down for a jack move. It's a murder rap to keep you dancing, with a crime record like Charles Manson. AK-47 is a two. Don't make me that motherfucking fool.
À-bas-le-ciel.
That's been the most profound thing. And I always at least tell people that. Like, if they ask me about a vegan diet, I'll usually tell them the story that I actually first heard from you. The one about getting off the bus and seeing the hot dog cart.
Right. Yeah.
And, you know, that you can make the choice. No one would judge you for it. No one around you would criticize you for eating that hot dog, but you know.
Yeah.
So I always tell them that story kind of with the ethics, and I always tell them the story, you know, I do feel like, you know, there's a different way that you manage calories that immediately happens.
Right. So just to kick it off, I mean, like, there's a video up from a couple days ago about my interactions with another student at this school. And she has seen that video, and she is furious with me. She hates me for that video. She would have hated me anyway. She already hated me. But, you know, in that conversation with her that I described in the video where I said, look, you know, I talked to this person who's a meat eater, and they asked me these questions, and, you know, I talked about the consequences of it. The way that conversation with her started was simply that I invited her. She had been sitting with a friend here, with another one of the students, and they were complaining they had nothing interesting to do on the weekends. And I said to them, well, look, you know, I'm going to make this for, like, my own interest, my own purposes. I'm going to make a trip to the zoo here. If you guys want to come, you can. So it was actually a totally, like, the start of the conversation was totally friendly and not directly related to veganism. But the downward spiral from there really was that she said, oh, well, you know, my mother taught me that she and her mother would never go to a zoo, that they consider that deeply immoral and what have you. And my response to that, which is why I mention this now, because I say this all the time to meat eaters, have said this to my Chinese teacher, because, you know, talk about this stuff in class. Again, you talk about it in Chinese as a way of practicing the language, talk about what's going on with your life, whatever's meaningful to you. But, you know, I said the conditions of the animals in that zoo, you may think they're terrible, but they are the best conditions of any animals in China. And they're among the best conditions for any animals in the world, you know? So that may be shocking, that may be horrifying, but let's deal with that shock and horror and then, you know, move on. So I think, you know, one of the things that makes the whole question of zoos meaningful, whether we're talking about zoos in China or zoos in Thailand or zoos in Canada, is that it raises the sort of philosophical question of how do human beings and animals live together. And, you know, again, very often in zoos, people are confronted with conditions that they consider immoral and what have you. And it's like, well, okay, let's really think that through. If you think this is immoral, what do you think about whether, I mean, the comparisons are surreal, but what do you think about the pigs that literally live their whole life in a concrete box, on a concrete floor? You know, there are veal cows that live their lives literally in a wooden box, more commonly in a plastic box. You know, with today's technology, it's more often plastic rather than wood. But, you know, what do we think about a dog living its whole life, you know, as a domesticated pet? And even, what do we think about fish? You know, the mass fish farming. Even, you know, farming of crocodiles and alligators for alligator leather, you know, to make shoes out of them and so on. You know, the comparisons, they're surreal. But if that conversation starts at a zoo, that's a conversation I really want to have. And, you know, like it or not, it may be deeply embarrassing to you as a meat eater. It may be deeply upsetting to us as individuals. But the conditions we're seeing at the zoo are not the worst conditions for how human beings treat animals. They're actually the best. So that's my broad and general first response. But look, to give you something more, because I know you're asking, so specifically in Asia, you know, yeah, one of the memories that stayed with me from 9 years ago here in Kunming was especially seeing the bears, the conditions of the bears in cages. And, you know, I mean, at a zoo, you see a lot about the culture you're living in, because you don't just see the animals. You see how the human beings regard and relate and treat the animals. You see so many peculiar contradictions. Contradictions about compassion, but contradictions about scientific interest. Contradictions about education. Like, is this supposed to be educational? Or is this entertainment? Or what? Like, what is it? What are we doing if we go to see a bear in a steel cage? Which is literally what that was 9 years ago. It was, wasn't like a zoo. It was literally a bear in a cage. And, of course, there are people trying to stuff food through the cage to get a reaction out of the bear because the bear isn't doing much. It's not doing anything exciting. There are questions about the meaning of life in more ways than one that come up. And I remember, so this is 9 years ago, but here in Kunming, in the same city, I remember I saw a bunch of people weeping at the zoo. And I remember it was obvious to me they were not weeping because of the animals, but they were there at the zoo weeping. And I mentioned this to a colleague of mine, a guy with a PhD, an educated guy who's here. He's a really strange character also. He's an eccentric, but he is an intelligent and highly educated guy who knows China pretty well. And one of his comments to me said, if they were middle-aged people, which they were, if they were middle-aged people crying, he said, a lot of people in the older generation, they actually have a very firm sense of where they are and where they are not permitted to show emotion, especially, sad emotion like weeping. And he said, in the old days, people used to pay to go to the cinema just to be able to sit and cry in the cinema, because they didn't want to do it somewhere else. So he said that some places, like a zoo, rather than just a public park, that it was probably one of the places where people could go and kind of vent or mourn or deal with some of those emotions. So that also is fascinating. There are different levels on which, the zoo here, the way it's used as a public space and the reason why people go there, people here go to the zoo literally to play musical instruments. I've got some footage of that up, of people sitting in the zoo playing traditional Chinese musical instruments and so on. So, what is the future? On TV shows like Star Trek, there are no dogs on the Starship Enterprise. And there's no simple answer to the question of, how do bears exist in the city? How do bears exist in the forest? And whether it's bears or dogs or mountain lions. For me, there are so many questions there. And definitely, the jumping off point can be, a trip to the zoo. So that's the positive element of it. But, obviously at its bleakest, if you do go to a zoo and find yourself weeping or outraged at the conditions of the animals, which is quite natural. Sometimes people who are not vegan react that way. Okay, but I don't see that as a dead-ended emotion. I see that as the start of something really meaningful. I don't see that as just a meaningless, wallowing in self-pitying or something. I think if you are deeply upset by going to a zoo in Asia, that could be something really positive in your life as a whole. That's going to raise questions that are really worth answering.
I think honestly, like, if you look at like things that I've said, I think this whole thing, like me sharing stories about like my zoo experience, it's kind of like an evolving thing. I think I've given a few different answers to why I'm doing it to different people. I think if I'm thinking like the most real thing is just to like, I just feel like, I saw a lot of videos where people, zoos are prisons, zoos are this, zoos are that, and I wondered, like, I think you've talked about in your videos, have you ever actually talked to a zookeeper?
Right, yeah. Yeah, same with scientists and everything else. Yeah, right.
I just, I think there's value to having some stories, some real stories actually occurred to a zoo as kind of having something out there for people to chew on. I've had people comment on some of my videos. One person in particular I'm thinking who said, I watched your video. I haven't been to a zoo for 30 years out of like ethical issues, but after watching your video, I'm going to go check out the zoo. Right. Just to see what's up. Right. Because I do think it's one of the true. Bite-Size Vegan talks about in one of her videos how literally she questions whether or not zoos are evolving because in like 5 years nothing has changed. Right. Yeah, but I think one of the things, you look at the San Diego Zoo. I remember going to the San Diego Zoo. There is a section of the zoo that's beautiful. Right. Just the foliage, like the amount that they grow themselves is unreal. The amount of bamboo that they grow themselves, they literally have parts of the zoo where they just grow bamboo to feed the animals. And it's beautiful. It's like you're walking through a bamboo forest. It truly adds to like the feeling of the zoo. The size of the chimpanzee enclosure they have there is unreal. Right. Like, just you look out and you feel like you're looking at a sprawling mountainside. Right. But then there's a part of the zoo that you go there and it's grotto. And some of those have super, super endangered animals. Right. But if you go back like 40, I'm going to totally say something that's not wrong, but literally decades, we're talking decades here. Yeah. That zoo was entirely grottos. Right. I don't think it's a 5-year thing. I think it's decades in which zoos will evolve.
Sure. Well, yeah. The other side of this is that it leads us to question the idea that the government has all the answers or that the government is omnipotent. You remember there was this hit film, Blackfish, I think it's called, it made a lot of people question the ethics of SeaWorld, of keeping whales in captivity and so on. So I knew a guy in Canada. He was one of my professors, but that wasn't his main gig. And so this is just like 1 year ago or a year and a half ago now, I forget, but not that long ago. Anyway, he was working as a university professor, but he's also an author and a filmmaker. He does all kinds of other things. And he had made a number of documentaries about killer whales, as they're called, orcas. Orca is also a ridiculous name if you look into it. They're both ridiculous names, orca and killer whale. But, and they are actively hunted as entertainment in this sense, to be on display in places like SeaWorld and so on. So I remember I made I made a laconic comment about, the evils of our local marine park there. Actually, you know what? I don't even think it was that I said it was evil. I didn't say that. I think I just pointed out that I had looked up the statistics for how much money the government was giving to this for-profit business. And he knows I'm vegan and so on. So I think that was at the time my snotty comment. I just said, the government of this province just gave so many million to our local, whale and dolphin amusement park. Which, by the way, is not SeaWorld. I forget the brand name. It's a different brand name, but it's the same type of attraction. And his answer, without missing a beat, he didn't reply to what I said. This is good rhetoric. He looked me in the eyes and he said, anytime one of the whales are injured in the wild and we want to save them, that's the only facility we've got. That's it. So in terms of keeping the endangered wild population alive, the government and the conservation scientists and the conservation activists and people like him, they all totally rely on that amusement park. If that amusement park shuts down, they've got nothing. That's it. The only veterinarians with that kind of expertise, the only tanks that can hold, we're talking about wild, taken from the wild, that can hold them temporarily so that a vet can patch them up and put them back in the wild. That is it. So it was a brilliant response on his part, because obviously he's an ethically inclined guy. He obviously wants to actually help the whales. He probably is not comfortable with them being, exploited for entertainment this way. But the flip side is, if you think you can shut down that facility and that somehow, the government has infinite resources to do positive things for whales in the meantime, you're wrong. So it's immoral, it's unethical, it's horrible, it's a terrible compromise. But he answered the question, why is the government giving millions of dollars to this park that, especially just lately, vegans and non-vegans both, all kinds of people at that time were really protesting against SeaWorld, Marineland, against this type of attraction. It was like, well, that is the institutional capacity we've got to help, the endangered wild populations also. And with zoos, there's a very similar thing. It's pretty atrocious seeing, these monkeys living their whole lives in cages in the zoos. Do you think that if you shut down the zoo, there's a better facility somewhere else where the government or conservation scientists or academics in a university could work to help those monkeys, the endangered species specifically, recover to a breeding population, what have you? For me as a vegan, it's easy to be self-righteous. It's easy for me to say, shut it all down, smash all the cages, set all the animals free. That's easy, But the whole reason why my YouTube channel exists is that I'm not really interested in easy answers to complicated questions. I'm interested in dealing with all the murky, complicated, moral gray areas, et cetera, as you know.
One of the things that I've been engaged on the topic of zoos is, and a few people have mentioned this, but this idea that if ideally in their mind, these things should be happening at like universities, real research facilities, that animals ideally in their minds, there's a stigma of zoos. They want animals to be taken care of by, whether it's a sanctuary,
Right.
whether it's a reserve somewhere.
Right.
And there's actually, I question, because I think, a lot of those university people are in the zoos, first of all. But one thing that I'm researching right now is, because I want to make a video about it, because I think just the role that, medical science has played in this, the role that sanctuaries and reserves have played in this, and zoos, in fact, it's a complete horror story.
Yep.
The story of the northern white rhino.
Oh, yeah.
It's absolutely, and one of the things I think is most impactful is that basically breakdown of the story. There's 3 northern white rhinos left, and there's one male, and I believe it's just 2 other females.
Wow.
But there's basically the gene pool is almost nothing basically at this point. Although there's other interesting questions, because the northern white rhino is what it is. It's a subspecies. It's not a species.
Right.
The southern white rhino is doing quite well, but the northern white rhino is the one that they're doing all these things to. But they decided to move these. They were living in a zoo at one point, and they decided to move them. I believe they were living at somewhere in the San Diego Zoo, some facility associated with San Diego. But you can tell that I just have so many topics that I think of that I literally flip from one to the other. So I'm a little off, but the base of the storyline is true. But they moved this animal to a reserve in Africa.
Yeah.
And when they moved them there, because the reality is of poaching, and these animals, you move them back to a reserve in Africa, the reality is they're exposed to poachers again. Whereas in a zoo, that's one of the things that they don't have to deal with.
Right.
And while they can have someone watching them and protecting them, they still have to recognize, there's no guarantee.
Right.
We can't guarantee that something will go down.
Right.
So what they actually did was they cut the horns off these rhinos. Like,
I can totally imagine why. Right. To prevent the poaching, right?
In order to destroy, their attraction to poachers, they disfigured these animals in such, a horrific way. That they look strange when you look at them. It's like this long horn that these animals have is just this nub.
Right.
And I just think, people have this, this ethical attachment to the reserves and, universities and stuff, that they're going to do the right things somehow. That zoos are doing all the right things, and everyone else is doing all the right things. If somehow, we would close zoos and give these places a chance, and it's all over the place.
Right.
It's just, it's a complicated thing.
I think one of the interesting contrasts, because the first question you raised was the difference between legitimate research and what zoos do. Part of what zoos do is research, but I don't know, probably less than 10% of it is what they do. But
Can I just tell one story real quick? About
Sure.
There's one of my favorite stories that I ever took out of a zoo was it was literally just me driving in a van with one of the vets, the head vet of the zoo. And I don't remember what we were doing. I think we were going to pick up a crate that we needed to inspect somehow. I might have only been an intern. I might have just been riding along for the day just to see what it was like, what the vets did. But one of the things that he talked about was one of the research proposals that was going out. I think it was, I don't remember the school. I probably shouldn't say it anyway. But he was talking about how it had to do with primates, and it had to do with yawning, because yawning is one of those things that it's known to be catchy. A human sees one human do it, they're likely to pick it up. And this student, apparently, this grad student, he wanted to do this project where he wanted to look at yawning in primates, and he wanted to see if a similar phenomenon occurred in primates. And I remember in the nasally voice that this head vet had, I remember he just said, "That is just so stupid," because one of the things that was true for primates is yawning is a territorial thing.
Oh.
They yawn, they open their mouths, shows their teeth. That's how they say, you need to get away from me. Oh. So of course, one primate does it, the other one's going to do it because it's a threat display. So it was just completely psychologically silly. And that's just one thing I picked up that's just one thing I had to throw in there, because that's my favorite story ever about research in zoos.
That is interesting, though. Certainly, if we ever had that instinct, we don't respond to yawning that way at all now. Huh, interesting. There's just one human culture, to my knowledge, I think, in the whole world, but there still is in the extreme remote part of northeast India, part of India that's closer to Myanmar. It's not part of the India as we normally think of the shape of India. It's way out on the limits. But there is one culture there where they still regard smiling as a threat, that showing your teeth when you smile is perceived as a threat. I have never heard of any other culture where that's true for human beings. I mean, but obviously many animals show their teeth as a threat. And of course that culture today is now those people, as they start to watch television and become more involved in modern society, I'm sure that if that hasn't disappeared, then it's disappearing right now, along with many other footnotes in the history of anthropology. What I was going to say about the issue of legitimate research versus all the other things zoos do, I noticed there is no such conflict with botanical gardens. We have a botanical gardens here in Kunming. There's a very famous botanical gardens in Sri Lanka. Those places, they exist primarily for research. And they do a lot of work on endangered plant species. I mean, you may or may not be familiar with this, but it's similar in that sense. They're often trying to preserve plant species from going extinct, keeping a catalog, so that the DNA isn't lost. And they also work on even reviving plant species that have gone extinct, where there's some seeds left, there's some DNA material, and they can splice things that can actually bring back plant species that have already disappeared from the world. But all kinds of other plant research. That tends to be the main thing they're doing, and once in a while they put up an exhibition showcasing that. But otherwise, the botanical garden is open to the public for a few hours per day, and some people, not that many, go and see the trees or go and see whatever it is that's being displayed. So, I mean, obviously, the issue of the ethical weight and the horror that is associated with zoos and with something like SeaWorld, with the places that keep whales and dolphins. I think on the one hand, it has to do with the animals themselves, with the sense of how much territory they should have, what behaviors they should normally be allowed to enjoy, with their own natural inclinations towards sex, violence, territoriality, whatever behaviors they are, the presumed contrast between the animal in its natural habitat and the unnatural habitat. And on the other hand, I mean, there's also just death involved. Before I said it on YouTube, I'd never heard anyone mention the issue. I mean, obviously you've now discussed it on your YouTube channel. You may have discussed it before I did, and I didn't see it. I don't know who said it first, but I to my knowledge, I was the first person to talk about. If you have a tiger in captivity, you're not just keeping a tiger alive. You're killing cows and lambs and chickens every day to feed that tiger, and horses. I mean, in your channel, you talked about killing horses for horse meat to feed the animals in the zoo, where there's that dimension to it also. As soon as we're into meat-eating animals, then we're talking about a much longer shadow of animals being killed, some animals being killed to keep other animals alive, which supposedly is a problem for us vegans because we supposedly don't believe in, in speciesism. So yeah, but I just put that to you. I mean, it's an interesting contrast at any time as a thought experiment. You can say, well, if this is a problem with zoos, why is it not a problem with the botanical gardens that serves a similar function but doesn't have all the same ethical quandaries, ethical issues?
Can I quickly go back to the Blackfish thing?
Sure.
Just because that's really relevant to me, because I actually just saw it last week.
Oh, cool. Yeah.
Like I think my mom's seen it at this point. She got it from the library. I've seen it. I think I got it on YouTube. But I saw last weekend. I researched it because I want to do a video because there's a trainer who's been very vocal about his abilities. He sides with SeaWorld, and there's some points that he make that I completely disagree with. But one of the things I researched is there's one trainer. I'm sure you said it, but I miss it. You've seen that movie, right?
No, I've never seen Blackfish actually. Okay, go on, yeah.
There's a trainer in that movie. I want to say his name is John Hargrove. I know his last name's Hargrove, but I can't remember I might be spacing on the first name. But he's one of the guys that they got to talk about, the reality of workers in captivity. Some of the things that trainers do. He actually does kind of a play-by-play on one of the incidents that happened there. But he's actually someone who's been slandered by SeaWorld. You can look up videos on YouTube of SeaWorld actually making a campaign just against him. Wow. He's maybe in the movie he's less than 15 minutes. but SeaWorld literally made a campaign against him where they bring up little texts that he made, where he said some things while under the influence of alcohol and things like that, which is interesting in and of itself. But he's someone who, after that movie, apparently, from what I understand now, there's legislation that prevents SeaWorld from from trainers actually going in the water. They're interacting with animals outside the water, and he was one of the individuals who actually testified in that case that actually got that legislation passed. And the first thing that I thought of when I read that was when you talked about how vegans want to play with vegans. They don't necessarily always want to play with people who aren't necessarily vegans but are involved in those industries. You talk about a lot in vivisection. But I thought that was a really good example of someone who's involved with that. Someone, if you put Chris or John, I'm completely botching his name out. If you put Mr. Hargrove on a panel, and like vegans were in the audience, I'm sure he'd get booed. I'm sure people would say nasty things, like throw things at him. But he played a legitimate role in legislation that improved something, that changed. So that was just something that I thought of when I saw that movie that was real and was really relevant to something that you talked about.
Yeah, I mean, I think though, but that's partly because vegans don't understand that process of what legislation is and why expert opinion matters. Like, it matters to me as a human being. Like, for me, it's interesting to talk to someone who has that kind of direct experience with animal behavior and also with the institutional behavior. Like, whether we're talking about vivisection or zoos or whatever. I mean, it's true of your channel. This is why your channel is so interesting. It was really interesting for me to hear you talk about, killing horses at a zoo so that you can feed horse meat to tigers or whatever the animals are, or wolves or what have you. To me, okay, this is interesting, and this is the kind of, analytical information that you can't get by just sitting down with a bunch of other vegans who already agree with you. And I'm probably going to make a video soon talking again about this concept of abolitionism in veganism. And there's nothing wrong with the word abolitionism. It's not that I'm offended by the basic concept. I understand why people say that, why they want to say they are an abolitionist vegan. But it leads to people wanting to shortcut or disregard exactly these questions. Like, oh, well, if you actually want to testify in Congress, if you actually want to inform a legislative body, this is how the industry works, and this is why you need to regulate it in this way. For any specific regulation, those are exactly the guys you need, right? You need informed insiders who really understand the process, who can really answer those questions, who can not only speak from experience, but who can literally testify, who can say, yes, I have seen this with my own eyes. And you see that even with something like, the congressional inquiry into steroid use. Who do you think speaks on a panel about steroid use? You can get a local Catholic preacher, you can get a Catholic priest who, for whatever reason, goes around saying steroids are bad, but he doesn't know anything about them, he's never used them, he's never seen them. Or you can get someone who is maybe a sports medicine doctor who himself used to provide illegal steroids, but who is now willing to come on the stand and say, look, here's how the industry works, here's what's bad about it, here's how it needs to be regulated. You absolutely crucially need insiders, whether it's the athletes themselves or the medical doctors themselves, who are willing to come forward and talk about how those things work. And those will always be people who are tainted. Those will be people who have blood on their hands in some sense. Those are people who participated in it. That's true, whatever. Congressional inquiries into, war crimes in Vietnam. There's no point. The moral purity is actually, just irrelevant to the actual process. You want the informed opinions of people who are really involved. So anyway, people like you, I mean, I hope, frankly, when I watch your channel, what I hope you're not stuck being the guy who talks about zoos for the rest of your life. Like, I think 10 years from now, it's going to be very different for you to look back on this, to say, okay, there was a time in my life when I worked in zoos. There's a time in my life when I talked about it a lot. And I think, it's always going to be meaningful for you. I think it's something you're always going to talk about with people from time to time. But you're also going to make a transition where this isn't going to be the crusade. This isn't going to be the flag you carry for the rest of your life. You don't want to always be the guy who talks about zoos. So what that transition is for you, I think, is also a meaningful question. Because obviously, you're a whole human being. Zoos are only one part of your life, and it's only one part of your own vegan activism, yeah?
Yeah, I've been aware of that. There's certain... The one that you talked about, actually killing animals, that's a video that I actually looked back on, and it was something that I knew I should talk about.
Right.
I didn't know how to talk about it though, and I think I frame it in that video that, oh, if you're a vegan and you want to go in the zoo field and something, that these are realities that you have to deal with.
Right.
It's not going to be, when I went to school, we literally had people who would come in, like applying to our zoology program, saying that, what they want to do is they wanted to play with baby tigers all day. Yeah, well, playing with baby tigers, I mean, I could see that being something that a vegan or a vegetarian would come and say. That would be their ambition in life. Right. Something nice and soft like that having to do with animals. But so that's kind of what I thought. But I'm not. When I watched that video, I'm actually not happy with. I'm not happy with that for some reason. Right. I can't put my finger on why. But it was something I knew I had to talk about.
Right.
Yeah. But I have a few videos. It's really, I hear something. Like, it could be one thing someone says. It could literally just be, seeing Happy Healthy Vegan, having a title that says Pokemon Go is not vegan or something like that. Right. And I'll know what I want to talk about. Yeah. So it's something that's been very spontaneous, to be honest.
Right. No, I totally. Well, my videos are spontaneous too, and I think, in the future, I can really imagine that you take your thoughts about zoos and you put them together into a more formal lecture, like a written lecture that you give at an animal rights conference, and then, that's recorded and put. I can totally imagine you going through a process like that. I'm just saying, like, as one human being to another, as important as that is, and I can imagine if you gave that lecture once, you might then a year later give the same lecture at a different animal rights event or animal rights conference. I can totally imagine that because I think it is meaningful. I think what you have to say is very meaningful for other vegans, and I also think it's meaningful for you to talk about it. But I'm just warning you on a human level. Like, I personally, I don't want to be the guy who talks about Cambodia for the rest of my life. Cambodia comes up in my videos, but like Cambodia doesn't own me. You know what I mean? And I could. Actually, just this morning I was thinking about. I started recording a video about some atrocities in Laos or what have you. It's still part of my life. It still comes up. But that's all I'd say is that I was just making it in a sympathetic sense the statement that zoos don't let zoos dominate. It's fine, and even if it's for the whole next year, even if it's the main thing you talk about on your YouTube channel, that's great, and I would enjoy the videos myself. I'm interested in that. But you are more as a person, and your own potential as an activist long term. You're more than that one issue. That's all I'm saying.
No, I understood what you're going for. I'm just I find you interesting and a challenge to talk to as well, because I'm literally someone who has to sit with it for a while and think about it. Sometimes like I literally pick something, talk about Blackfish to add something next. So I got you were saying, basically. That's my long-winded way of saying we're cool. But and now what one of the things as far as talking about zoos that I have realized that I'm gonna have to deal with eventually, or at some point I'll pull all stories that are easy to tell. There are certain stories I have. I think I've mentioned in a comment with you, the one about the anteater, the 250K anteater. Right. That's a story that maybe 10 people on Earth know. Right. And that's a story that if someone who worked at the place that I worked at, they could watch that video and they'd be like, oh, he's telling all our secrets. Yeah. So that is there, and I still have friends who are in that field and stuff like that. And I have to, figure that at some point I'm going to get to the point where you're like, I'm starting to get to, content I haven't talked about before, where I have to question whether or not, is this going to hurt someone if I talk about it? And I'm going to have to make decisions. Right. I mean, I didn't leave that field in the best of way. It was a conscious decision. I could have gone forward and had a career in it. But, I had some broken ties in that industry on some levels.
All right, so that's it. I'm not asking you to divulge anything secret, but I mean, I thought you quit the zoos before you became vegan. Isn't that correct? I mean, you chose to leave, right? Yeah.
Yeah, they're not connected. It's okay. Happenstance. I became vegan. You're like, oh, literally. I think I talked to you before that story with Vegan Cheeto, where I literally was on a streaming app with him, and I asked him, Charlie, do you think that this is something that would be worth talking on YouTube? Right, and he was like, oh my God, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. That conversation actually occurred in real time and had in a big way, affected, what I'm doing today. Yeah. And, in some way I'll always owe that to him on some level. In a very real way, I'm talking on YouTube and because of his influence. The talking about zoos is something that I realize might be finite. Yeah. It'll be something that, and I'll always have other things that I want to talk about and stuff like that, but definitely at some point, I won't be talking about zoos. I think that's definitely reality.
Yeah, I hope one day I'm no longer talking about Cambodia. We'll see at that point. I was going to say too, just to use two examples in parallel, but this applies to so many things. But the issue of zoos and the issues of hunting. I do not. I mean, as vegans, and again, this is a problem I have with the abolitionist approach. The abolitionist approach says abolish everything. And there isn't really an acknowledgement that we deal with day-to-day real questions of priority. You may or may not have already heard this anecdote, but on my channel I've complained. In Victoria, there was this group of vegans, and they were making it their top priority to attack horse-drawn carriages. And in this case, the word attack isn't that inappropriate. Then we're just criticizing it, but to protest that and obstruct and stop the horse-drawn carriages, because the horses pulling the carriages were being terribly exploited. Now, yes, from a vegan perspective, from an abolitionist perspective, okay, yes, a horse pulling a carriage, it's not vegan, it's bad, okay. But this is in the context of, a civilization that is built on, every day, millions of pigs and cows being killed, eaten, turned into leather. The people taking the carriage ride are wearing leather shoes. What is a realer issue? You know what I mean? Like there's so many levels in which this is absurd, and it's just a use of your time and energy. So I mean, again, this is an issue within some of the currently popular theories, currently popular approaches to vegan politics. No, we do have to make questions of priority, and I do not think that shutting down zoos should be a priority. Now, we've already talked about some of the reasons why that is, because zoos serve more than one function. Blah blah blah. Definitely, legal reforms to change the ethics of zoos. Or even, I just mentioned again, I would support a law within Canada, for example, that made all zoos operate on a strictly non-profit basis. I think that would be a very interesting law to pass. And then probably zoos, probably the question of research interests and public entertainment and education, probably a very different set of questions. And to what extent it's the taxpayer's responsibility and to what extent it's based on zoo admissions. You'd have a very different set of questions if they were non-profit. But with all that having been said, the funny thing is when zoos are especially targeted by vegans, because some vegans do, they really want to shut down zoos. Some vegans especially target scientific research, vivisection and so on related to cancer or whatever the case may be. And some vegans especially want to target hunters. And all of these things are marginal. In terms of the body count, these are all incredibly insignificant compared to, diet, exploitation of animals for diet or leather or what have you. There are obviously some symbolic significance to these people and some emotional significance, but actually, the animals being kept in zoos are very small in number, and this doesn't have the same. So the animals being killed by hunters are a very small number. But the other thing that to me, the reason why I'm mentioning this now, the irony is that the people who work in the zoos, they're some of the only people who really appreciate animal intelligence, who really see it, who really have experience, of the kind you talk about, and many more. And, when I was studying Cree and Ojibwe, Algonquian languages, First Nations languages, these are native languages in Canada, I was reading accounts that were translated from Cree into English, so, you look at both, of people's lives, people who had really lived as hunters in a fairly traditional manner out on the frontier. I just give you this as one example of a story from this. This guy was a traditional hunter, and he was talking about the types of intellectual relationships he had with these wild animals. And he mentioned there was one, I believe it was a weasel. I may have the species slightly wrong, but it was a weasel or something resembling a weasel out in the woods. And he wasn't his pet. It wasn't domestic. It just lived in the wild. But it would come around and chat with him and talk with him. And he would give it bits of food, especially because he was hunting other animals and cutting them up and what have you. And he got this cooperative relationship going with this weasel, wild, untrained animal, where it understand he would be looping a fishing line, and he would hand it. So it was a little loop, like a little noose, like a little loop in the fishing line, and he would hand it to the weasel. And this would be ice fishing in winter, and the weasel would go under the ice, would swim into the water, and pull this out to help him set up his fishing apparatus. It would swim back, and he would give it food to reward it, and so on. He had all these bizarre stories about the intelligence of wild animals, some of which he got to know just literally because he was sitting in the forest for many long hours, and these animals, out of boredom and curiosity, started spending time around him. Now, from a vegan perspective, this guy, he killed animals every day. In the zoo, does also kill animals every day, and also it's holding them in captivity and so on. But I mean, you know, again, there's something here for us to learn. This is my fundamental point. There's a voice here that's really important and worth listening to, you know, now and for the future. And by contrast, I've met and talked to slaughterhouse workers. No, I do not believe that employees of slaughterhouses, in that sense, have anything meaningful to say about animal intelligence and the meaning of life. Not in this sense. Don't get me wrong. Slaughterhouse workers are human beings too. But, you know, there has to be some recognition that what we're talking about in terms of conservation, in terms of the future of how humans live together with animals, what happens in a zoo, and even what happens with hunters who literally live in the woods, who literally live with animals, and who may or may not respect animals. They may be jerks, you know, as an individual person. They may just be a jerk about it. To me, again, it's just not as simple as the abolitionist approach of saying, this is evil, this is exploitation of animals, therefore abolish everything. Do it today. We have difficult questions of priority. And we have difficult questions just of meeting people like you and listening to them. And saying, oh, here's someone who knows what it's like to shoot a horse in the head and to cut up that horse and feed it to a tiger. You know, there's a perspective on life and animal rights here that I don't know. You know, there's something here for me to learn.
Well, for the record, I've never actually shot a horse.
Okay.
I've seen and been around that.
Right.
And I think the most horrific stories in that video are honestly, for me personally, one about the small caliber gun being used to kill the horse, and just hearing the multiple gunshots, not being able to just picture the horrific scene that's going on, and then to actually have to go in there and actually not finish the job necessarily, but then actually prepare that animal to be fed. Like, it's not. You know, I talked about it, you know, there being a real teamwork aspect, and that's, you know,
you talked about smashing in the heads of rabbits and all that. It's horrific. Yeah, it's horrific, but it's worth hearing. Yeah.
I forgot about that. That's actually the worst one. But no, rabbits, chickens. If anyone's interested, not horses though. But no, it happened. I was around it. One of the things I think from the last time we talked, I think was, you know, I think the things that you told me about the Native Americans that you had experienced with made me reflect a lot on my own, honestly. And one of the things that, like, I recently, like, I literally just saw this and I thought of, like, what you were saying and stuff, and I think it reflects a lot back about this common history that you're talking about. I literally, like, watched the video. I guess there's, like, this show where celebrities, basically, in some kind of frivolous thing, they go back and they look at, they work with a historian, they find out their roots, their family. And there was one episode with this actor, Don Cheadle, who's been in, like, Hotel Rwanda.
I do know who Don Cheadle is, amazingly. But, yeah, I do know who Don Cheadle is. Good, yeah. This actor, Don Cheadle.
But he's been in I guess he was, you know, one of the things that they came back with his ancestry was that, you know, his lineage has, you know, slaves, and that they were owned by Native Americans.
Oh, really? Wow.
That was something that I had never honestly thought of. Yeah. That Native Americans would have owned slaves, and not only that I guess, like, even after, like, the Emancipation Proclamation, or whatever, like, Native Americans didn't necessarily release their slaves. Yeah. Like, they said, you know, we're, you know, our own nation, you know, we're not going to do that. And I don't remember what they said about when it actually transpired that, you know, his ancestors became freedmen. The first freedmen actually turned up, but that was a profound thing to me. Yeah. This idea that, because I never would have occurred to me, like, on some level, you know, I would have never occurred to me that Native Americans had owned slaves at any point, had owned Africans as slaves.
Yeah. Well, you know, I've got a reverse example. This is long before I studied Korean and Ojibwe as languages. It's interesting, you know, my mother has said to me, she said, you know, you always cared passionately about Native Americans, about First Nations. Like, when you were a small child, you were already pissed off about this, which is interesting. I mean, she remembers that. I don't. That's not really how I remember my own thoughts on the matter as a kid. But she said this was always kind of a political issue for me, even in childhood. And I mentioned also, this is also very unusual, but it wasn't based on a storybook idea of Native Americans of the past. It was really based on who they were today. You know, like Native Americans as people who watch TV and own cellular phones. Back then, they owned Walkman. It was them as real human beings, not the kind of glorified vision of them. But I remember I was talking to an old frenemy. Frenemy is really the word in this case. He's he's not my friend. But I remember I was talking to him in Canada years ago, and he basically gave his reasons for why he, as a left-wing person, he was a left-wing political activist type, why he didn't want to be involved in it, didn't want to care about the Native American situation, which, ultimately I have to respect his honesty. I mean, it's a decision everyone makes in Canada. You choose which political causes you're going to be involved in, which not. And I remember he made a number of statements about the history of slavery as part of his explanation. Slavery and how slavery had created countries like Canada, the United States, what have you. And I just said to him simply, I said, that's what we did to them when we wanted to get rid of them here in the British Empire, Long after the British Empire supposedly made slavery illegal. When you look into the details, slavery disappeared from the British Empire in a very slow series of stages, and most people are taught in school a simplified history that makes it seem that slavery became illegal much earlier than it actually did. But in Canada, long after slavery was supposedly illegal in British colonies, when we wanted to get rid of our rebellious native peoples, and I don't mean that in a casual sense, I mean native peoples who actually rose up in rebellion, we sold them to the sugar plantations. So we were exporting as slaves our own native peoples to that part of the world. And I am told that some of the DNA surveys were confused by this, because you can have people today who are, black, predominantly of, African Caribbean ancestry. But you have also people who are of mixed black and indigenous ancestry. But when they look into who the indigenous people are, they're not the people indigenous to the Caribbean. They're not the people from those islands. They're people from central Canada or something, So these are the brutalities and vagaries of history that, we're now left to draw the lessons from and move forward from. But yeah, I mean, ultimately, look, sorry, this is off topic, but for me, it's right on topic. I had someone writing to me in my Patreon group, someone who paid the $1. Thank you to everyone who pays $1 to listen to me talk. And she was talking about how inspired she felt by the things I'd said about Laos and Cambodia, those wars, America's war in Laos, and so on. It is actually difficult to answer the question, if you're being sincere. What does this mean to people today? What's the message in terms of public education or ethics? What does it mean for you and me today to look at this as whether it's, so those are two opposite examples. What does it mean that, yes, Native Americans owned Africans as slaves? What does it mean that, yes, Native Americans were sold as slaves amidst African Americans? And sorry, the ending of that anecdote, when I told to that guy, I remember what surprised me was that he was really upset by that. He was really disturbed by it. And I don't know why. I mean, it's not so different from everything else we did in the history of slavery or the history of the British Empire. But for whatever reason, my telling him that anecdote really shook him up. And I guess really challenged the excuses, or not the excuses. It challenged the reasons he had in his own mind for, I guess, why he was more interested in kind of black power activism and not, Native peoples' rights. I guess, or it challenged some left-wing assumptions. I don't know, but that was really upsetting to him. And for me, it's not really upsetting. But it's very difficult to really ask and answer the question of, if I'm going to take this message to people today, why does it matter? Why does it matter to them? And I don't buy into this sort of thing that we should all be on the internet screaming about every social injustice, and that the screaming is in and of itself. When I share those stories with people, for one thing, I don't tell them to everybody, and I think there is a real question of, where are we going with this? How is this supposedly making you a better person, or how is this making the world a better place? What do we actually do with this history now, moving forward to that unwritten science fiction novel of what the future is supposed to be?
There's one video that you did, and it was, I remember it's I think my favorite YouTube ending of all time, where you're talking about this subject.
Yeah.
And you equated to shouting at the moon.
Yeah.
I think that's my favorite ending of all time.
Yeah.
I think it's...
Yeah.
You know, there's a lot. Again, there's as you said, there's a lot of people shouting on YouTube about various sorts of things.
Yeah.
I thought that equation to shouting at the man in the moon or whatever, just added to the lunacy of it, just highlighted it in a way. Yeah. Just within that, I thought that was super profound, personally.
Well, look, I mean, thank you. I can take a compliment. But, I mean, the other thing I can say, maybe we should wrap it up now because we're past 2 hours. Just a good length for a podcast. But, I think the questions about tradition, they do relate to the questions about the future in a very simple sense. Because, a lot of time I deal with hostile questions, obviously about veganism, but about First Nations, Native Americans, and all this stuff, too. One of the questions I've asked, it has an impact when you talk to Europeans. In the future, do you want to live in a world where in the future there are no bears in France? Wild bears, not bears in zoos, wild bears. It's a really simple question, but when you ask it about the future, it actually does have an impact on people. Obviously, in Laos, that was a real question I had to ask people. Do you want to live in a world where in the future there are no tigers? In Laos, wild tigers. I knew a woman in Cambodia. She literally grew up in a village in Cambodia where people got killed by tigers, where human beings being hunted by tigers was a fact of daily life. And today, that area is a parking lot. There is not a single tree. There is not a single tiger. It's just everything has been flattened for human progress. And, that's a real question. What do you want your children to grow up never knowing what a tiger looks like? And, hey, let's say it. Do you want your children to grow up never knowing what it's like to be afraid because there are tigers in the woods? Isn't that a loss, too? You know what I mean? Growing up, frankly, with that fear, with that awareness that the forest is not a playpen. The forest has tigers. Or if it's in France, that the forest has bears. Isn't that a tremendously sad thing? And in the context of Native Americans and so on, I have really had to ask people, do you want to live in a world where this language is extinct, where there isn't a single human being left who can communicate in Ojibwe, Cree, or whatever the language is? So for me, I mean, again, I guess that's the sense in which my traditionalism is tied into these ethics, these political questions for the future. Because ultimately, I'm challenging us to say, yes, with all this technology, with all this science, can't we see a future where we literally make space for these other animals? And yeah, there's a cultural component to that too, for these other languages. But man, when you look at it, it's really bleak. Because I don't know. I don't know. In the future, I don't have a lot of faith that there are going to be any tigers in Cambodia. I don't have a lot of faith there are going to be any bears in France.
I remember in one of your videos you talked you talked about when you went to the zoo and you actually took footage. You mentioned at the end of the video, and you put together what I actually thought was a very cool montage of this one species of I think was it noseless macaque?
That's correct. It's a snub-nosed monkey. Yeah, that's correct. Yeah.
Snub-nosed monkey. That's right. And I actually looked that up after you had that video, and literally it's a whole genus.
Right.
The snub-nosed monkey is its own genus. When I say genus, to me it has meaning as someone who studied science. I'm not sure the average person, if they understand, it's a specific branch, of classification. But every species in there, that's the whole genus. Every species is endangered.
Right. I know.
What if there's a point, when every single animal, every single species from an entire genus, an entire branch, clade of evolution is only in a zoo.
I know, it's so sad. And look, I'm glad you raised that because I was going to mention this to you. You have at least one video, I think more than one, talking about the fact that, nature documentaries are fake. They don't really show you what the animals look like in the wild. That also is an example of that. So I'll mention this because it's also part of the spiritual significance of that monkey. Now, I'm a nihilistic atheist, so you'll see why I use the word spiritual in just a moment. But, in that video, even at the very end, where it shows them supposedly in the wild, if you know a little bit about the monkey, you can tell that's not the wild. You can tell it's fake in exactly the ways you talk about. For one thing, they're down on the ground. They're sitting on a felled tree, picking up bits of bark, picking up bits of food, bits of moss, lichen. in the wild, in terms of their natural behavior, that's where they'd be the most terrified. Any predator can run by on 4 legs and kill them when they're on the ground, right? When they're on the floor of the forest, right? Including just a dog. A wild dog can come by and tear their neck apart. They're totally defenseless against the wild dog. And even in that video where it shows them up in a tree, it's not really a tree. They're kind of sitting in some twigs. Kind of can't really bear their weight. In terms of how they would really live if their ecosystem were intact, they were up in these dense trees. Here in Yunnan, we have what's called a cloud forest. Cloud forest in contrast to rainforest. It's quite interesting. Part of the function of this forest, you have trees up at a level where it would catch passing mist, passing fog, and ultimately, yes, passing clouds. And so the trees would get more water because, the water would turn into droplets and be caught by the forest and come down. But you have these dense, dark trees. And the monkeys are black-faced, as you know. Black-faced, some of those monkeys. They have both black and white. They have the sort of ghostly white features and black. So there's both black and white in their coloring. And the only time you would see them as a human being would be walking through that dark, dense forest. And then these faces pop out at you. Right? Because they're curious. In the wild, they like human beings. They want to come and have a look. And, of course, that's why native people in that part of Yunnan, they thought they were the ghosts of the dead. For 2 reasons. One, because they have no nose. They're noseless. So it looks like a skull. It looks like a human skull to some extent.
Oh, absolutely horrifying.
Right. But secondly, that'd be the only time you see them with these silent faces popping out of the trees and looking at you with curiosity. And you can't see the rest of the monkey, right? You can't see. So it's really something magical and beautiful and lyrical and special for this part of the world. And the forest has been so destroyed that you can't even put together a fake documentary trying to make it look like they're in their natural habitat or conditions. And we're down to that point of saying, can we take a few dozen of these things and give them a shot at living, in what's ultimately going to be a man-made artificial terrarium. We can keep a couple trees together, but it's past that point. So this is wildlife management at its most extreme. Is can we basically simulate a little patch of wilderness for them in part of China where, to simplify, all the trees have been cut down. Yeah. So yeah, to me that's kind of a really meaningful and moving example in so many ways.
I like hearing those kinds of stories, especially when you talk about them being in the zoo. I remember one experience that I remember having as a zookeeper that until I thought about it later, I didn't really think about. But I remember there was 1 week that we spent fixing up this entire enclosure for these animals that were coming in. Yeah. We did it a number of times. I don't remember why it sticks with me, but I just remember people would walk by, and the running joke that people would make, "Oh, this is the human exhibit." Mm-hmm. Because, they see the keepers, and, you get annoyed because every single person comes by, they think the cleverest person in the world, and they said something that every other person said. But it reflected me, all the stupid things, people say, and hearing these stories about these animals that have this true mythology, this true, context in which they matter. And just, on some level, if I was a keeper at that zoo, and I know that, and I see these animals come up because, as you say, they're curious and they're actually interacting with people, they'd probably be a great exhibit animal. Right, sure. Because they'd actually come up on some level to hear the stupid things people would say, about those animals, knowing the real, how in the past they've been considered special. And, you look at this weird, noseless monkey. Do you think he hides stuff in there? Right. Or, weird things like that? Yeah.
Yeah, but look, I mean, there is no political party in the world that has a target to increase, natural habitat, wild wilderness habitat. And, when I was in France, obviously I've done research on this in all these weird countries, in Cambodia and Laos and Thailand. So I've done it in a bunch of places. But France is useful because France is so similar to us as a society. France is not that exotic. But, the French government was always publishing these lies about how many thousands of hectares of wilderness France has, right? And the way they did that is, France has controls a bunch of remote islands in the Pacific that sometimes have 0 human inhabitants they're uninhabited islands, or sometimes there's, one military naval station there where boats can dock, and otherwise it's, it's uninhabited and there are, some birds flying around or what have you. But, their claims about wilderness and, expansive areas for wild animals are totally based on places on the map that you and I would just not consider France. Legally, they're French territory. But this is like, the United States controls Guam. Guam is a territory of the United States. But there's another sense in which Guam is really not the United States. There's another sense in which Midway Island and these remote properties. But, when I was in France, I got to see the single largest area of so-called... It's a national park. I can't even call it wilderness. And all the people who lived around there said, look, it's really dangerous to walk through this park because if you go during hunting season, all you hear is pock, 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 pock. You just hear gunshots going off. And this park is a shooting gallery. And, there's nothing wild about it. I just say, it is what it is. It's a field with some feral pigs in it. And, they keep the feral pigs around because people like to shoot them dead. Wild boar, whatever you want to say. And, nobody, so look, yes, some people want to stop wearing leather shoes. What an incredibly small minority of the population. It's depressing. There are so few of us who have made the ethical leap necessary to say, you know what? I can do better than this. I can stop wearing leather boots. That's already a tiny percentage of the population. But it's also depressing to me. It's also, and it's a really urgent issue. There's nobody or almost nobody sitting there in France looking at a map saying we need to make some space so that bears can exist, and not for my entertainment, but there's got to be some percentage of the map this has to be a priority, and I know we have other priorities, hey, somebody's got to conquer Syria again, somebody's got to conquer Afghanistan and Iraq again, there are untold millions and millions of dollars being put into other priorities in life. But for me, short-term and long-term, I'm basically, I remain horrified by human beings that so few people look at the map of France and think that's a problem. And I can say that about Laos and Cambodia too, to some extent. Just somewhat different story.
I want to ask you, and
I hope this isn't too depressing for you. Go on.
No, but like in the last few minutes, you've talked about preserving cultures. You talked about preserving animals. In a very real way, I'm aware that the dollars matter, that the dollars can make a difference in saving an animal. Do you think that money can preserve, raising money for a cause? Do you think a millionaire can start a fund tomorrow and say, oh, I want to raise this much money to save a language?
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. Look, is that
possible?
I think it's happened. I think there have been some projects like that. For me, something I used to say to people in that part of Canada, where, Native people are still a significant percentage of the population by blood, but very, very few of them can speak the language. I would point out to people, when you go to a bank machine here, you put your card in, you have English, French, Chinese, minimum, maybe Spanish or another language also. But nobody ever thought it was important to have Cree or Ojibwe or Mohawk or any other native language. When you go to the bank machine, you press a button to choose your language. So yeah, you can think about it in terms of preservation, in terms of conservation, but ultimately, the question of the problem is forward-looking, right? Is not putting the language in a museum, which you can do for $1 million. You know what I mean? I think that's the side that a millionaire can do, which is very positive, and I encourage that also. If you got $1 million and you care about language diversity or what have you, their millionaires can do really positive things that way for sure. But looking forward, I remember talking to one of my professors, and again, they were just very impressed with me because I thought about these things in such a different way from the other white people who were interested. Because, some of the white people are Christian missionaries and different types of eccentrics. But I remember talking to a professor, I said, look, what's our timeline? When are we going to have a first chemistry textbook written in Cree? And they were shocked. And I said, yeah, science textbooks for children. Obviously, I'm not talking about, advanced research level textbooks being written in Korean Ojibwe. It's just you're not going to have a large enough population to do that. And many languages within Europe are like that too. If you speak a smaller language within Europe, for advanced scientific research, they have to use a language like English or German. They have to use a larger language to get really specialized stuff. But yes, science education and developing the vocabulary to talk about science in those languages moving forward, where this is not just about preserving, your grandfather's stories or legends, which is obviously a very real part of it. A lot of people want to preserve the legends and songs and music, traditional songs in those languages. Moving forward, if this is going to be part of a meaningful life in Canada, it has to be in the bank machine. It has to be in those kinds of prosaic uses also. And you have to have a bunch of bored kids in a classroom going, oh no, it's science class again. And learning, learning stuff they don't want to learn in the language too, So, yeah, I don't know. For millionaires, I think definitely nature conservation is easier than those really complex questions of language conservation. And in both cases, you rely on people like you, Jay. You rely on people who have hands-on experience. You rely on people who've lived with the ethical contradictions and quandaries and who know these things work. The contradictions within the community and the culture on that side, the contradictions with how humans live with animals, how animals actually live in the wild. You really need to learn to appreciate the perspectives of the people who have that experience and have that knowledge, which right now, from my perspective, the vast majority of vegans don't. Okay, look, great talking to you. Do you want to wrap it up there? I mean, if you want to say something more,
One more question.
Great.
And maybe this isn't content that you necessarily want, but I wanted to float something out to you, because if I don't, I'm going to regret it. Like, I'm going to think about it forever. But,
cool.
I know...
I can always censor it later, don't worry. Cool.
We talked in the beginning about how you create thumbnails and stuff like that. Like, how can you create through your video? I was wondering, because, honestly, I am willing to kind of accept, that the vegan embassies of this world are going to come out and say, I'm the, hello, mini Mr. Clean. Yeah. I like the Dr. Evil one better than the Mr. Clean one, personally. But I was wondering, and I respect, people have certain ways of doing things. I know that sometimes people give me ideas on how to do things, and I have my own way. I don't care. But I think I always thought it would be funny to have the thumbnail for a video with you be to you send me, and I would send you a matching one. Like one where I'm in the exact same pose. I'll shave my head like perfectly, and like that'll be the thumbnail. It'll be like, what? Wait, is that him again?
So we can do that. But you might want to wait. I don't know if you want to do it for this podcast. I have a suit being made by a tailor right now, and I only thought of this afterwards. I went to a tailor and I ordered a traditional Chinese style suit, a gray suit with a certain kind of collar. And only afterward did I realize Dr. Evil. Because that's right, and that's the style of suit both worn by the original Dr. No character. Because Dr. Evil is a parody of Dr. No, who wore a Chinese suit. And then Dr. Evil's character, I think the style of suit he wears is just a little bit different. So coming up, if you want to, you can do a cosplay as me. That's true. I could send you a posed photograph, and you could match it. Then we could use it on both of our channels, whatever. And but also, if you wanted to, you could do a cosplay as me, as Dr. Evil. I'm not going to do any makeup. I wouldn't do any makeup or anything, but just me in that gray Chinese suit with the Chinese collar. That could be a hit for you. And I mean, and if you get a suit like that, believe me, you can get a lot of use out of it. Those are really good suits. Okay, great. Look, it's wonderful that we managed to stop this podcast on a positive note. Let's stop before we talk about anything too depressing. Wonderful meeting you. And like I've said to so many vegans the best, I hope I still know you 5 years from now. What I'm doing right now is not activism. It's making friends. It's making connections for the future. But, I hope, the next 5 years, next 10 years, we can all make something positive happen. And this mess of eccentrics on YouTube, it's a much more positive basis for, future positive political action than a lot of movements had when they were first getting organized. So here's to you, man. Here's to us. Here's to the future.
You and me, toe-to-toe, no, maybe. Knocking niggas on the block daily. Your weekly, monthly, and yearly. Till it's over. jumping motherfucker, coming straight out of Compton. I'm the type of motherfucker that'll smother your mother, make your sister think I love her. Dangerous motherfucker raising hell. If I ever get caught on big bail, I don't give a fuck, that's my problem. See the motherfucking cops, I don't dodge them, 'cause I'm smart, I lay low, creep a while. If